sun hung low over the dusty plains of West Texas, and Thomas McKinley stood at the edge of his property, holding a shovel in his weathered hands. He was 63 years old now, and the ranch that had been in his family for 4 generations felt emptier with each passing year since Martha had died. The wind carried memories across the golden grassland, and Thomas often found himself talking to her, as if she were still sitting on the porch, waiting for him to come in for supper. On this particular afternoon, Thomas had received word from Sheriff Davies that someone had been found on the old Miller property adjacent to his land. The Miller place had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades after old Henry Miller passed away with no heirs to claim it. Squatters and drifters sometimes took shelter in the dilapidated barn, and most folks in town just looked the other way. But this time was different. Sheriff Davies had called Thomas specifically because of where they found the person, and in what condition. Thomas drove his pickup truck down the familiar dirt road, kicking up dust devils behind him. The sheriff's cruiser was already parked near the old barn, and Thomas could see Davies standing with his hat in his hands, looking solemn. "What we got here, Tom, is a delicate situation," Davies said as Thomas approached. There was a young woman, probably in her late 20s, and she had taken shelter in that barn. She passed away sometime in the night, and given that this is technically on the boundary of your property and the abandoned Miller land, we need to handle this proper. Thomas felt his chest tighten. The thought of someone dying alone in that cold barn with no one to comfort them in their final moments struck something deep within him. Martha had always said that no person should face their end without kindness. Nearby, Davies continued explaining that they had tried to identify the woman, but she carried no identification. She had been traveling through by the looks of it with just a small backpack and worn shoes. The county would handle the burial, but given the bureaucracy involved, it might be days before anything could be arranged. Thomas looked toward the barn, and something in his spirit stirred. He thought about Martha and how she would have responded. She would have opened their home to this stranger without hesitation. She would have made sure this young woman knew she mattered to someone, even if just for a moment. "I'll take care of the burial," Thomas heard himself saying. Davies looked up surprised. "Now, Tom, that's generous of you, but you don't have to do that. The county will handle it eventually." "No," Thomas said firmly. "No one should wait in a morgue drawer while paperwork gets sorted. She'll be buried on my land, proper and decent. I'll get Reverend Patterson to say some words." Davies nodded slowly, understanding that when Thomas McKinley made up his mind, there was no changing it. That evening, Thomas stood in his workshop building a simple but sturdy casket from pine wood. His hands knew the work from years of craftsmanship, and he took his time making sure every joint was square and every surface smooth. As he worked, he thought about the young woman and wondered what her story had been. What had brought her to this lonely stretch of Texas? Did she have family somewhere who would never know what became of her? Had life been kind to her, or had she known mostly hardship? The next morning, Thomas had chosen a spot on a gentle rise on his property, where wildflowers grew in the spring. It overlooked the valley and caught the sunrise just right. Martha had always loved that spot, and they had talked about building a small bench there someday. He began digging in the soft earth, and the physical labor felt good despite his aging joints. As he worked, he didn't hear the car approaching until a voice called out to him, "Please don't dig that grave yet." Thomas turned to see a woman, probably in her mid-50s, stepping out of a dusty sedan. She had dark hair streaked with silver, and her eyes were red from crying. Her hands trembled as she approached him. "Please," she said again, "I'm looking for my daughter. Her name is Sarah. Sarah Coleman. I heard in town that someone had been found." Thomas leaned on, his shovel feeling his heart sink. He didn't want to be the one to deliver this news, but he could see in this mother's eyes that she already knew. She already felt it in that way that parents do. He gestured toward his truck where the casket rested, in the bed covered with a canvas tarp. The woman, whose name Thomas learned was Rebecca, walked slowly toward it. He pulled back the tarp gently and opened the lid, just enough. Rebecca's legs seemed to give way, and Thomas caught her arm, steadying her. She let out a sound that was part sob and part prayer, and Thomas felt his own eyes burning. He had lost Martha, but he couldn't imagine losing a child. After some time, Rebecca composed herself enough to speak. She told Thomas that Sarah had struggled with addiction for years. There had been treatments and relapses and moments of hope followed by devastating setbacks. 6 months ago, Sarah had left home saying she needed to find herself somewhere far from the city and all its temptations. Rebecca had received a few calls and postcards, but then nothing for the last 2 months. She had been searching ever since, following the thin trail of her daughter's journey through small towns and truck stops. And now, here at the end of that trail, she found Thomas McKinley preparing to bury her daughter with dignity and respect, even though Sarah had been a complete stranger to him. Thomas invited Rebecca back to the house. He made coffee the way Martha used to, and they sat at the old kitchen table while Rebecca told him about Sarah. She spoke of a bright little girl who loved horses and wanted to be a veterinarian. She talked about the teenager who wrote poetry and had a laugh that could light up a room. And she cried as she described the young woman who had lost her way battling demons that Rebecca couldn't fight for her. "I failed her," Rebecca said quietly. "I should have done more." Thomas shook his head. "From what you've told me, you did everything a mother could do. Sometimes people have to walk their own paths even when those paths break our hearts. You loved her and she knew that. That matters more than you might think." Rebecca looked at him with gratitude in her exhausted eyes. Over the next 2 days, Thomas and Rebecca worked together to prepare for Sarah's burial. Rebecca wanted to help, and Thomas understood that doing something with her hands was better than sitting still with her grief. They lined the casket with soft fabric that Rebecca had brought, and some of Sarah's belongings: a worn journal filled with poems, a silver bracelet that had belonged to Sarah's grandmother, a photograph of Rebecca and Sarah from happier times. Thomas contacted Reverend Patterson, who agreed to conduct a service word spread through the small community, as it always does in small towns. And on the day of the burial, more than 30 people showed up. Most of them had never met Sarah, but they knew Rebecca's pain and they knew Thomas's character. They came because that's what people do when someone needs not to be alone. Martha would have loved this, Thomas thought as he looked at the gathering. The service was simple but profound. Reverend Patterson spoke about mercy and second chances and how every life has value regardless of how it ends. Rebecca spoke through tears about her daughter and the love that had never wavered even in the hardest times. And Thomas said a few words about strangers and kindness, and how we are all just passing through this world hoping to matter to someone. As they lowered Sarah into the earth, Thomas placed his hand on Rebecca's shoulder. She leaned into him, this woman he had met only days before, and together they stood as the sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In the weeks that followed, Rebecca stayed in the area. She rented a small room above the diner in town and came out to visit Sarah's grave. Often Thomas would find her there, sitting on the bench he had finally built overlooking the valley. They would talk sometimes about Sarah or Martha or about nothing in particular. Other times they would just sit in comfortable silence watching the wildflowers sway in the breeze. Rebecca began helping out at the ranch. She had grown up around horses, she told him, and it felt good to work with them again. Thomas found that having someone else in the house, even just for morning coffee, made the rooms feel less empty. They fell into an easy friendship built on shared grief and mutual understanding. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Rebecca said something that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. "You gave my daughter something I couldn't," she said. "You gave her dignity at the end. You made sure she wasn't forgotten or discarded. You treated her like she mattered." Thomas was quiet for a moment before responding. "Everyone matters," he said simply. "That's what Martha always believed. She used to say that we're all carrying burdens we don't talk about, and the least we can do is be kind to one another. Your Sarah mattered, and she always will." Rebecca reached over and took his hand. They sat like that for a long while. Two people who had found unexpected comfort in each other's company as autumn turned to winter. Rebecca decided to stay permanently. She found work at the local library and kept a small apartment in town, but she spent most evenings at the ranch helping Thomas with the animals and sharing meals. The townspeople who had initially been curious about the woman who had come searching for her daughter now simply accepted her as one of their own. Thomas found himself laughing again, something he hadn't done much since Martha passed. Rebecca had a dry wit that caught him off guard, and she wasn't afraid to call him out when he was being stubborn. "You're as hard-headed as my late husband," she would say with a smile, and Thomas would pretend to be offended. On the first anniversary of Sarah's death, they held a small gathering at the grave reverend.